What's up guys, it's Nora. I'm back with part 2 to talk about what happened after birth and then what happened on the postnatal ward and then what happened complication wise in the week following, 2 weeks following. Yeah, where I left off was I gave birth, baby was healthy, that was great, and then we needed to address the tears. And they did not tell me how much I tore. They were very focused on one internal tear, not knowing if it was grade 2 or 3. And the difference was if it's a 3, you have to go to the operating theater or the OR. They had to, and I didn't even think about this, they had to inject 10 mLs on each side of my, you know what, into the muscles that are painkillers. They didn't tell me exactly what the painkiller was, but into both sides to do the tear exam. Panicked a little bit during that, kind of stalled it a little bit. They had to give me some laughing gas for it. It wasn't actually that terrible. And they did the tear exam. And they really weren't sure if that internal one was a grade 3 because that was the only one that they kept talking about. So I was like, oh great, I only tore once. I didn't tear only once, but I didn't know that until a week later. They weren't sure. So my midwife, blah, blah. And also I want to just preface that there was a doctor during the delivery, during the vacuum. But my midwife was like, I want to have the doctor come look. The doctor came back and looked. He wasn't sure. She was like, there's 2, or the doctor was male, but the midwife wasn't sure either. So she was like, there's 2 midwives that are coming on after her shift. And she was like, they are much more like skilled in the tears and like knowing what grade they are. So she was like, I would really like them to come in and look. So I was like, yeah, sounds great. Had another midwife at that point come in and look, and they still weren't sure. So they were like, we think she needs to go down to the OR. So I was like, fine, sounds cool. The doctor told me initially I'd be put out, and I was like, that's great, sounds good. That was not the case. Jacob did some skin to skin while they were doing all these exams because I was afraid to like be holding him and like be in pain and stuff during that. And then I held him for 8-9 hours until I went down to the OR. That was a disaster. At this point, the whole birth and the fact that like nobody was helping me and I was in an ambulance, and it was like very kind of mentally confusing or just mentally challenging because I'd gone into the labor ward feeling like no one was helping me. I wasn't getting any pain relief. No one was addressing the problem. I felt like no one cared and everyone was just like there to be there. To then at the end of the birth feeling like the midwife, the nurse, or the midwife and like the nursing assistant really did truly care and like wanted to help me out. So I'd gotten to that point where I was like, oh, I feel like people really care and are listening to me. And I say this because I'm always the patient that things go wrong with. No one listens to me when I tell them things. This has happened on multiple occasions, and I'm always the patient with complications. And so the anesthesiologist came to talk to me before and was like, no, we're gonna do a spinal block essentially. It's essentially an injection, not to the epidural space, but another space that's much, much smaller. And she was like, you're gonna be awake for the entire like hour-long procedure. And I was like, excuse me, what? Like I'm mentally drained. I hadn't slept also either because like he wanted to eat, and then Jacob had to leave and go home to take care of the rabbits for a few hours. So I was just like, and there was no bassinet or anything for me to safely leave him in. So I was just like stuck in bed awake, having to hold him, exhausted. There was no nursery for me to send him to. So I had been awake. I'd only slept for a few hours when I was having contractions, and like 3 hours, not even, prior to that, going to bed that prior night. And then I didn't sleep at all during labor, and I was falling asleep in between contractions. So I was exhausted and mentally drained. And I did not want to have an unmedicated birth, and that's the way it went down. And they didn't even like show up in time for me to sit still, or there being no point in the epidural. And then so I like avoided the epidural, and then for her to be like, no, you're gonna be awake in the OR for like over an hour. I'm gonna spinal block you just like an epidural essentially. Yeah, that like wasn't flying with me. I very much expressed to her, I was like, no, I don't want this to happen. I would rather you just put me under. I was like, why can't you do twilight sedation? She was like, well, you're at risk and fluid overload, blah, blah. And she like explained all of the risks. And I fully understood all the risks, but mentally I was like, no, I can't do that. I cannot be awake during this procedure. Like, you need to put me out. And she was like, I can't do it. I was like, can we postpone it for a few hours so my husband can come back and I can just like sleep? Like maybe I'll be in a different mentally place. And she was like, so then she had to like go to the doctor, and they were like, no, like we need to do it. Like you have a right to say no and like not be repaired. But like, they weren't really giving me a choice with trying to suck. My husband returned He slept like half an hour. Yeah, it like wasn't great. And then I practically had the baby the whole time. They brought me down to the OR. I have very limited mobility in my lumbar back. I never was a person that could touch my toes. I did dance and I always struggled with like flexibility back there. And I've been told by physical therapists that I have limited mobility. So when it came to placing said spinal injection, we went into the OR with a good attitude, and her and I were talking and we were having a good conversation, and she tried 6 different times in 3 different spots in my spine to place the injection and could not do it. And part of it was that I was struggling to bend my back enough, on top of the fact that she also like kept going in a certain way that she must have been like near a nerve group, because every single time she'd do it there was like pressure and pain down my right side, which was a fear of mine. So because of that, after 6 attempts of her poking 3 different spots in my spine, I was like mentally broken. I sat in the OR and I sat on the table and I like would not make eye contact with her, because then she like came around and was like, because I was like, I want to be done, I want to be put under, like that's what I kept saying, because I just kept crying through the whole thing, because I really didn't want to be awake, and I just was like, I really don't want this, but I knew it needed to happen. So she like came around and tried to be like, so my colleague's gonna like come and try if you like will allow it. And I, at that point, like I said, I was like broken. I sat with my head down, refused to, like she was directly in front of me, and I just sat down and just sobbed and sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. And I was like, I don't want this, I just want to be put under. And she was like, well, I did make an agreement with you that you at least like needed to let me try. And she was like, but I would really like my colleague to come in and try a few more times. And I was like, no. So then she was like, okay, like we will put you under. But she still like wanted to like give me, I think, a break. So I still sat up, which also hurt like the daylights because I was torn. So I was sitting there for like 20 minutes in so much pain because they really hadn't given me anything still for the pain. Besides they were like trying to pump fentanyl into me, but my IV kept kinking and it really wasn't working. The fentanyl was more making me sleepy than taking away the pain. So I sat for 10 minutes with my head down and them trying to talk to me, and I just sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. And then this man showed up, because I guess since all maternity patients are like high risk because we have fluid overload in terms of like intubating us. And so she was like, in all these cases, there has to be like a second anesthesiologist there. So she had to like call this person from another part of the hospital. She still tried to convince me to get him to try when he showed up, and I was so broken. I was like, no. So they finally agreed to put me under. I woke up with a tube in. Not the first time, but I woke up with the tube in. And they did take it out like as soon as my gag reflex was like coming through. And then at that point, I had to go to recovery. They didn't tell me I was going to recovery. They told me my husband was also going to go to I knew I was going to end up in a double room. But they told me my husband was going to be put in that double room with the baby comfortably. And they ended up putting him in like the snack room. And I think because they were like, felt weird about putting a male in the female's room. I don't know. But I was told a bunch of things that didn't then end up following through and happening. And so then I didn't know that I was going to be sent to PACU. And at that point, I was nauseous. So they were able to give me some juice, and I was able to like fully wake up from the anesthesia. And then they sent me to my room, postpartum, and I arrived there at like 7 a.m.-ish. And then Jacob had to leave to go take care of the rabbit and go to class. So I got a little bit of sleep and relief, but at that point I was still like practically immobile. And again, they didn't tell me how poorly I had been torn, minus the internal one. They did tell me it was only a grade 2, but they didn't tell me about the other tears. So that was great. And I still had the catheter in, which I was pleased about because I didn't have to like get up for a while. But then they took the catheter out, and then I was afraid to pee. And then I couldn't hold my bladder. So I stood up once I got the feeling to pee. Turns out that was like way too late, and I peed all over the floor. And then we had a very rough, I only stayed on the postpartum floor. I was there in total from labor to being discharged about 36 hours. I was on the labor or postnatal ward for about 24. Like I said, I arrived at 7 a.m. and the first few hours were fine, and then the second night hit. And the second night, as I've heard, is the worst for a baby. And because that's when like babies are starting to get hungry and like your milk might not be coming in. And I was so tired and still didn't sleep that much that day. And then the person who was next to me had her family come in during the day. So I didn't even get to sleep because her kid was there and they were playing TV shows and I was just so uncomfortable and not sleeping. And then the second night, going into it was the worst. At like 8 o'clock, baby wanted to feed. Baby fed on both sides for 2 hours, and twice in 2 hours. And then he was still hungry and he was not settling. Well, he settled for like about an hour, but he was still awake. And the way that beds were and the bassinet were, it was extremely uncomfortable getting him in and out of the bassinet, and it was really hard, and he was refusing at this point to sleep in his bassinet, and I did not know what the problem was. And I did not want to like co-sleep with him or anything, although they do co-sleeping here in Sweden. There are like some guidelines, but I was like, no, I don't want to do that. And plus like my roommate wasn't sleeping because he was losing his mind. Because then after the hour that he had, he was up for again for 2 hours, and there was no milk. Nothing was happening. No more milk was coming in. He had sucked me dry. It had been 5 hours since he was awake. And the midwives and CNAs, like I was on that floor, but I felt like I was like probably the healthiest patient on that floor because other people, I was only there because I'd been sewn up in the OR afterwards. But other people had been there for like C-sections and probably like hysterectomies and like postpartum hemorrhages and like things that went wrong in their birth. So I didn't want to like burden anybody, but I wasn't getting like much lactation support. And the nurse came in and I was like practically losing my shit because I had not slept practically at this point. I'd maybe slept like 2 hours, 3 hours. I dozed off early, but I hadn't slept that much since the birth the prior night. So she came in and I was like, you guys don't do donor milk here? Because in the US, most hospitals give you donor milk up until like your milk comes in. She was like, no, there's no nursery for me to send him to, so I wasn't gonna ever get relief. My husband wasn't allowed to stay overnight because it was a double room, and I was severely regretting not bringing the colostrum in from home. So I was like, I need formula. I was like, he has been up for 5 hours. They were like, yeah, but he wants to like sleep on your boob and like be near. And I was like, listen, I've not slept. I'm head bobbing, falling asleep, sitting here. I was like, this isn't safe for me. It's not safe for him. I don't want to drop him. I'm afraid I'm gonna drop him. I was like, he's hungry. It's not fair to my roommate. He is still crying. It's been 5 hours. I was like, so clearly he's still hungry and I'm not able to provide for him. So I was like, if you giving me formula for like 24 hours to supplement a little bit for him helps him, I was like, then so be it. So I was like, can you just give me like 10, 15 mLs of formula and we can just go on our merry way and he will maybe sleep. She reluctantly did. She really didn't want to. She reluctantly did. She gave me a medicine cup and I said, what do you want me to do with this? Like in the US, we syringe feed or bottle feed. She was like, well, I don't want to, they were all about not disrupting the breastfeeding here. So she was like, just like put it up to his lip and like in between his gums and have him take it. Well, he took about 5 mLs and then a few minutes later, he yacked it all over me. So then I felt even more defeated because I wasn't able to feed him super well. And he was clearly still hungry. He wasn't settling. I was like so sleep deprived. It was miserable. Finally, I think he like got too tired and chilled out and I was able to sleep. But at that point, it was like, at that time of the night, I was like, I'm going home tomorrow. I want to go home. There's no reason for me to stay here. At that point, nothing I was doing in the hospital wasn't anything that I could not be doing at home. So I expressed that to my nurse, and the next day the doctor came in and was like, hey, I heard you want to go home. And I was like, yes. I was afraid when he said that because I was like afraid he was going to be like, no, you should stay for a few more days. But he was like, no, that sounds great. Like you're progressing how we think you should be progressing. So yeah, you can go home like, and the home nurses will see you tomorrow. And I was like, yeah, that sounds great. Went home that day. It was a glorious feeling. And then we had some problems postpartum. Like I've been prefacing, didn't know how torn I was. Turns out there was a tear from like north to south that originated, I think, in the south. And it was diagonal. And I still, I went home on Tuesday. I went home on Tuesday. And the home nurses had come on Wednesday. And then they came again on Friday. And on Friday, they were like, we're gonna check everything with a headlamp. They didn't on Tuesday because they checked me before I left the floor to make sure there was no infection going on with my stitches. Well, they didn't say anything at that point. So I was like, listen, I'm having like a lot of stinging and burning like up top. And I wasn't told I was torn up there. So my guess is that like maybe because I had the fetal scalp electrode like up the front, I was like maybe it like rubbed too much in one place. I was like, I don't really know what the problem is, but like I'm peeing upstream essentially. And it's really bothering me. She looks, turns out I had that tear and I was stitched all the way up and I did not know about that. However, she looks at it and she goes, they sewed you too high and they sewed you too tight. I was out cold. I was intubated and they sewed me up wrong and they had the chance to fix it and they didn't fix it. They did it too tightly and they didn't. I was so angry. So she was like, you need to go to the gynecology ER. Didn't know that even existed. She like called and she was like, on a Saturday, because it's open, because since it's an ER, it's like open at all hours. She's like, I've notified them that you're coming. Show up at this time to the gyno ER and they will fix it. Had to go back. Everything was still extremely uncomfortable down there. And they had to cut the top 2 stitches and then essentially retie the 3rd one down. And she was like, yeah, I'm hoping it doesn't undo itself. She was very sweet. I really liked her. She was like, but there is a chance that it might undo itself. What? Yeah, didn't know that was going to be a problem either. So, luckily it never did undo itself. But then a week later, on last Friday, it's Friday now, but last Friday, I ended up back in the gyno ER because I have a swollen lymph node down there. What? But it's like near the spot of where I thought they might have injected me with those painkillers after birth. So I wasn't sure if I was like getting an abscess or a cyst because I've had abscesses down there before. Don't get me started. Turns out it's just a lymph node that was like rubbing against my underwear line. So, and then we've also had problems with him feeding and him being tongue-tied. And yeah, it's been a long road. I mentally can talk about it now without getting like teary-eyed. Mentally, the birth was very destroyed by mental health, and then to have complications and have to go back into the city so freshly postpartum by bus and by train and be in so much pain. It's been a lot. It's been a lot, but we're getting there. We're surviving. I wouldn't say thriving, but we're doing better than I thought we would be doing. I think that's all I wanted to share. I don't think there's any other details. Very different birth experience than I think I would have gotten in the US, but I think I would have been like bankrupt had I given birth in the US. Do I already want another baby? Maybe. Even though that birth really mentally destroyed me. Also, next time, like when I'm like 2 or 3 centimeters, I'm going in. No more waiting around. That with how I had the staff members come in after my birth and sit down and be like, your birth was not normal. Your birth was abnormally fast. This is not anything that we would expect from a first-time mom, which I know is why they denied me an ambulance. I think they just thought I was being dramatic, but no, next time I'm going to be like super anxious about it, which isn't going to help the situation. But hopefully next time I don't have to go unmedicated. So it was horrible. But thank you guys for watching. Thank you guys for listening. And maybe in the future I will have some more updates or maybe like a daily routine. We are still getting our routine like back in place because we've had so many appointments with like, also he had a photo shoot. He had his lactation appointment in the city. So we've been like back and forth a ton and his schedule is kind of like screwed up. But once we get a schedule, maybe when he's a few weeks older, I will share more of him on here. So thank you guys for watching, and I will see you guys next time.